By 1996, the hype around Doom had begun to diminish. In the wake of the original Doom's release, there had been a boom of first-person shooter games looking to take a slice of that pie for themselves, going bigger and bolder to get the attention of gamers. But Doom still had name power, and console manufacturers were keen to see it land on their platform, even if that platform was already on the decline. When Art Data paid handsomely for the rights to bring Doom to 3DO in 1994, it seemed like a match made in heaven. 3DO was a competent early 3D console and would host some impressive early 3D offerings during its lifespan. What followed was anything but enjoyable for everyone involved. An incompetent owner spouting deliriously about features that would never exist, a programmer overworked and misled about the state of the game she was about to sign up to develop, and a slew of awkward, bizarre and hilarious missteps that would see Doom on 3DO go down in gaming infamy. You may never have played Doom on 3DO, but I guarantee you've heard about it in one way or another. This is the story of Doom on 3DO. The 3DO was conceived by EA's founder Trip Hawkins after being frustrated by different consoles at the time being incompatible with each other. He wanted to be able to develop games for a single platform rather than spreading it out across different consoles. Hawkins formed a team within EA to work on this new platform, but eventually it was spun off into its own company, Hawkins choosing to step down from his role of chief executive of EA to oversee the 3DO company personally, although he did remain as the chairman of EA. Unlike a lot of other consoles released in the 1990s, 3DO wasn't envisioned as a console manufactured by 3DO themselves. 3DO lacked the manufacturing process to make it happen. Instead, the idea was that 3DO would create a standard and blueprints for the 3DO console, and then sell these to third-party companies who would develop their own interpretation of the hardware. 3DO would then collect royalties from each console and game sold. The low royalty charge per game made the console enticing to potential developers. Nintendo and Sega were noted for taking higher cuts of sales from each game sold, and this frustrated a lot of publishers and developers. The focus for the 3DO was to deliver high-end CD-based console gaming, offering 3D graphics at a time when they weren't widespread in the console space. The likes of Sony were actually briefly interested in developing consoles for the platform, but pulled back to focus on their own offerings. Samsung, Toshiba and AT&T all acquired the rights to develop consoles but never actually went through with producing them. There was even some serious interest from Sega at one point, with former Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske stating in a 2015 interview, "We had meetings in Japan with Trip Hawkins. These were very serious discussions in Tokyo. We talked about the possibility of, should Sega do a 3DO type of effort and combine with Trip on that machine? I was not for that, mainly because of the complexity of the product and the cost. The cost was very high." 3DO demonstrated its hardware at the Consumer Electronics Show in January 1993, where gamers and press members were genuinely blown away by the performance of the machine. Eventually 3DO were able to convince Panasonic, Gold Star and Sanyo to manufacture consoles, but in the months leading up to release, much was discussed about the launch price of the system. It remained a bone of contention that never truly went away. The console's recommended sales price of $699 was eye-watering compared to other consoles. This was pushed up by the business model that 3DO had adopted. In order to achieve profitability, 3DO had to sell huge volumes of consoles in order to recoup research and development costs from the royalties. Many of the console manufacturers sold machines for less than this, and the price was quickly dropped after launch to try and minimize the damage to 3DO's reputation. Despite this, Hawkins was so confident about 3DO's success that he didn't consider the likes of Sony or Atari as threats to the console's potential success. He believed that Sony would have a very difficult time breaking into the console market. The first wave of 3DO consoles launched in October 1993 and came with a smaller than expected games lineup. Many of the anticipated launch titles from EA had to be delayed because of the console's architecture being so complex that developers struggled to get to grips with it. It meant there was a lack of quality offerings at the console's launch. Despite a huge promotional push from EA and magazine outlets, the console failed to sell in huge numbers, and by the end of 1994, PlayStation hype was reaching fever pitch. EA promised to release 20 games for the platform, but a number of these would be cancelled by the middle of 1995. The console's launch in Japan attracted 70,000 sales, but this proved to be a false dawn. The console quickly got lost in the shuffle in the country and became more noted for users using the machine to play pornographic material. By the middle of 1995, the console had only sold a reported 700,000 units, and the writing was already on the wall. Panasonic and Gold Star dropped their consoles to $299, and 3DO were busy hyping up the M2 successor. This would never see the light of day. The 3DO would begin losing support from game developers and eventually platform partners. Panasonic were the last company holding the bag and even bought the exclusive rights to release consoles for 3DO when the M2 came out. As stated previously, this would never come to pass. In interviews after the demise of 3DO, Hawkins attributed the business model causing different console manufacturers to not work together. Panasonic, Goldstar and Sanyo never came together to form a cohesive front for the console. This led to a very fragmented marketing campaign and ultimately it harmed the console's potential. It should be noted though that 3DO did play host to some great games like Gex and is seen as a bit of a missed opportunity. Art Data Interactive snapped up the rights to Doom on 3DO for a figure that's reportedly between $250,000 and $500,000 in late 1994. The idea to do this came from Randy Scott, CEO of Art Data Interactive. During one interview he stated, "The stuff we're putting together is going to be phenomenal. I tell everybody to load up your rocket launchers and break out the suntan oil because this is the hottest version of Doom that you're ever going to see." He incorrectly believed that the project would be as simple as recompiling the game's code, dropping in a few new weapons and assets and making money from the project. He proudly proclaimed the game would touch down in October 1995, ready for the Christmas period. 3DO magazine covered this in the Winter 1994 edition and were very hyped at the proposal of Doom coming to the console. California-based Art Data Interactive have stunned the 3DO community by grabbing probably the most lucrative license of them all. Early next year, ADI will be releasing conversions of both Doom and Doom 2 Hell on Earth, id Software's enormously successful 3D shoot-em-ups. ADI have already been given id Software's original source code and are hard at work converting it to 3DO. While company president Randy Scott was insistent the gameplay would be identical, there's no way we would touch that. It's just go out and shoot everything. The game's presentation will be massively upgraded. 24-bit Cinepacks film sequences will provide in-game links, while actual game graphics are being entirely overhauled. Rather than using 8-bit color bitmaps, ADI will be using high-res, full-color sprites. The audio is also likely to be totally redone, and there's even plans for new monsters, weapons and levels. To add to this hype, Art Data sent footage of the planned Doom to stores around the US. This is what that looked like. As you can probably already tell, Art Data did little to calm the hype around this version of Doom, and as it would come to pass, games development wasn't quite as simple as Randy thought it would be. Once it became clear that the process to making Doom appear on 3DO wasn't going to be simple, Art Data were forced to seek out the assistance of competent developers. They subcontracted the project to an unnamed developer in April 1995, who told Scott that it would cost $1 million and take a year to develop. Scott agreed to these terms. That working arrangement though quickly went off the rails after Scott failed to pay the first milestone paycheck for that project. The developers downed tools and that version of 3DO Doom was dead in the ground. When the 3DO company reached out in the summer of 1995 to find out how that impressive version of Doom was coming along, they were horrified to discover that nothing had actually been done. Desperate for Doom to release on the struggling console, 3DO put Randy in touch with a programmer who had previously worked with 3DO to get Wolfenstein 3D onto the console. This programmer was Rebecca Heinemann. Becky was assured by Art Data Interactive and its employees that the game was basically done, yet when she received the files, she was bemused to discover the floppy disk she received contained only the PC game executable and files for that version of the game, no source code. Completely frustrated, she had to be convinced to stay with the project by those she knew at the 3DO company. Rebecca reached out to John Carmack and asked for the files that she needed. She had a previous working relationship with id Software and they agreed to ship her the source code for the Jaguar port of Doom overnight. Even with this in her possession, the game needed a lot of work to be ready for showtime, and so Rebecca had to work flat out for 10 weeks to make it happen. She recounts this on her website where she stated, I was misled about the state of the port when I was offered the project. I was told there was a new version in existence with new levels, weapons and features, and it only needed polishing and optimization to hit the market. After numerous requests for this version, I found out there was no such thing and that Art Data Interactive was under the false impression that all anyone needed to do to port a game from one platform to another was to just compile the code, and adding weapons was as simple as dropping in the art. My friends at 3DO were begging for Doom to be on their platform, with Christmas 1995 coming soon. I took this job in August of 1995 with a mid-October gold master date. I literally lived in my office, only taking breaks to take a nap, and got this port completed. Despite this crunch, Randy Scott continued to insist that he wanted those new weapons and features in the game, much to the annoyance of Rebecca, who recounted, "I began the port, all while being asked to add weapons, levels, monsters, and totally ignoring Randy, except for my request for Randy to provide the new music, which he did." Rebecca was forced to compromise the quality of the port when the 3DO's Cell engine threw up a critical bug during development. The way that the flat textures were rendered had to be changed to software rendering, hugely resource intensive on the console. The vertical walls were drawn with strips using the Cell engine, however the Cell engine can't handle 3D perspective, so the floors and ceilings were drawn with software rendering. I simply ran out of time to translate the code to use the Cell engine because the implementation I had caused texture tearing. I had to write my own string library because the one 3DO supplied with their compiler had bugs. String.h, how can you screw that up? They did. I spent a day writing all the functions I needed in ARM6 assembly. She also didn't have time to write a new audio driver for music playback on 3DO, meaning that the MIDI soundtracks were completely incompatible. She sent a blank tape to Randy Scott and asked him to sort that out, which he surprisingly did with his own band, which he was a member of. They recorded their own versions of the original Doom soundtrack and were placed onto the CD, allowing them to be streamed directly from there. Despite compromises to the way the game was rendered, performance remained awful. id Software were unhappy with the performance being showcased and told Rebecca to reduce the default screen size to increase performance. Rebecca did this, but also inserted a code into the 3DO version of Doom which allowed for gamers to access full screen mode through the use of cheats. It's likely this was done to allow for forward compatibility with the M2 3DO console that was reportedly on the way. Despite this full screen mode being unrepresentative of the final product, that didn't stop Art Data Interactive from choosing to use full screenshots of the game on the back of the 3DO box, giving a false impression of the experience gamers would get. Interestingly, Becky revealed that buried deep in the files she was given was an EA logo. She stated, "There was an Electronic Arts logo movie in the data, because there was a time that EA was going to be distributing the game, however that deal fell through." Bizarrely, Randy Scott went all in on the idea of Doom on 3DO having full-on FMV sequences, going as far as to employ Global Effects, a special effects studio which had credits in a number of well-known TV shows and movies. To bring these to life, $10,000 was spent on a Baron of Hell costume, which in my opinion looks more like a cyber demon, but that's just my opinion. That was not only cumbersome for the actors, but also produced huge amounts of heat. Hilariously, you could rent this off the production house's website in the years after 1996. When Chris Gilman, the owner of Global Effects, arrived at Art Data's offices for the shoot, he was horrified to find a small 10x10 green screen hastily set up in one of the side offices. Everyone had a miserable time filming various scenes that had no relevance to Doom, but seemingly shoehorned in a romance subplot. Reportedly, Randy Scott wanted to create levels around this story, and that's the vision that he kinda had for 3DO. Taking the footage they had, Randy Scott decided to showcase the footage at the Electronics Consumers Show in 1995, hoping to wow investors and get more money to spend on these monstrosities. Sadly, the footage shown to audiences at the booth over that weekend is lost to time, but people who did see it rushed to the internet to tell us how awful the entire thing was. A Jaguar developer by the name of Scott Legrand got to see these FMV sequences in person and wrote on a forum in January 1995, "If 3DO at all represents the FMV I just saw at the Art Data booth, Jaguar fans have nothing to worry about. It will suck, and it will suck royally. Imagine FMV with the acting quality of Baywatch, and the special effects of Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea. Yes, it was that bad, and no Pamela Anderson to distract you from its failings. Just a wimpy Darren Lambert, and feel alike as our hero." These FMVs wouldn't make it into the final game, and Randy Scott claimed it was because they were too gory and would inevitably appear in Doom 2. "We have FMV that we went out and filmed at one of our film locations, and it was so bloody and so gory we couldn't use it. You've seen the pictures of the model that we used for the game. It's so lifelike, it's incredibly terrifying. And we basically had this monster eat game players alive when he lost a life. We brought down a special effects artist and he was basically lying on his back, shooting upwards at the door that would fly eye open to reveal this monster with his snout buried in the game player's stomach, and when the monster brought his mouth up, he pulled it with a couple of feet of intestines, while all sorts of giblety things dripped from his mouth. It was a little too real, very graphic. The stuff we'll use for Doom 2 will be like that. Good lord, can you believe that this guy actually was already planning Doom 2 on 3DO? Rebecca saw these cutscenes and stated that they were just awful. Randy even attempted to get them put into the final game several weeks before the game was meant to go gold. Rebecca was able to push back on that one. She explained this during an interview with Time Extension, where she stated, "When I was asked to put this in the game, 2 weeks from release mind you, the guy running our data actually thought the green screen cutscenes could just be dropped into Doom 3DO and it would magically composite. As you can imagine, that is not a thing based on reality. I told him I could not use any footage and ignored him and shipped what I had." For all the issues this port faced, Rebecca was able to include a number of interesting features. She was able to use the Spectre, a monster that hadn't been used in many of the other console ports due to technical limitations. The 3DO version of Doom also features the entire Jaguar level set, giving it a higher level count than several other console ports. With the game in a somewhat playable state, Our Data ordered 50,000 copies to be printed from 3DO at a cost of around $150,000 in licensing and manufacturing fees. This high cost meant that in order to recover the expenses, Our Data needed to sell every single one of those 50,000 copies. They didn't even come close. Doom on 3DO released in the US on April 26, 1996. Playing Doom on 3DO is a pretty miserable experience. The limitations of this port are very apparent and appear throughout the experience, to the point where it's almost impossible not to talk about them. The simple fact is that while this port is a marvel considering the situation in which it was birthed, that doesn't ignore the fact that this version of Doom is deeply unsatisfying to experience. The game's performance is easily the worst of the 1990s console ports. Yes, I'm including Sega Saturn in that. Performance is borderline unplayable at times, with larger levels and large crowds of enemies bringing the game to its knees. Simply exploring the world of Doom is a tedious prospect in this version and very unfun. The frame rate regularly struggles to stay in double digits, sometimes dipping even below that. Simple tasks like walking down corridors lack the smoothness that even ports like the 32X version had. Combat is hard to comprehend at times, with imps' fireballs appearing more like a PowerPoint presentation as they approach you. Instead, the game just feels choppy and it's hard to look at for long periods. You can combat this by reducing the window size, something that the game's manual outright tells you to do, but this also makes the game harder to see and arguably makes spotting enemies in the distance much more difficult. Interestingly, the movement in this version isn't as awkward as that found in the Super Nintendo version, where input latency was a notable problem. However, the poor frame rate here undercuts this entirely and makes experiencing the game a true chore. Here the controls are probably one of the best things about the experience though. Much like with the Jaguar port, you can change button placements, so it's not all terrible. The game also remembers which levels you've played and allows you to return to them from the main menu, a feature that isn't in all the console ports, and so I count it as a small positive here. Another positive is that the game features plenty of content from the Jaguar version of Doom. The game features more enemies than those found in the Jaguar port, has more levels than the 32X version, and has legitimately one of the best soundtracks in any Doom game. That last point in particular is a real outlier here. The soundtrack is furious, intense, and genuinely adds to the overall experience in a way that PS1 Doom did for that version. It's actually quite transformative. Here's a quick sample of some of those tracks. Another problem here is that because the game runs at such a low resolution, things appear somewhat blurred and pixelated no matter what distance they are from the player. Enemies in the distance turn into a giant smudge, while items up close look blurry and unfocused. The constant presence of these ugly brown bars also lends this version a much weaker visual appearance. Other versions like the 32X have these bars on screen permanently as well, but I'd argue that they're a lot less grim to look at in those versions. The simple fact here is that 3DO Doom is just not a nice experience. Despite printing 50,000 copies of the game, it's reported that Doom on 3DO struggled to shift 10,000 of those. It's safe to say that many who have experienced this version feel it's the worst of all the console ports, and it's very hard to reach a different assessment. 3DO Magazine, which had covered the game prior to its release, harshly criticised its performance and graphical shortcomings in their review. While it might be understandable that art data should seek to aggressively boost such a massively delayed and skeptically regarded project, the reality turns out to be an embarrassing distance from the talk. Boasting of Pentium beating speed is simply embarrassing when it's only achievable by shrinking the screen by 50%. Similarly, talk about pixel-to-pixel resolution makes little sense when in action the game looks more low-res than virtually any 3DO Doom clone since Escape from Monster Manor. At some screen sizes, the display can resemble a fuzzy videotape as TV and game resolutions clash. Unfortunately, the rushed development cycle and insane demands from Randy Scott meant that this port never had a chance to achieve its full potential. Even after all this, John Carmack didn't believe the 3DO was a good landing spot for Doom, stating in an interview, "We have a few reasons for not developing on the 3DO, but development machine bigotry isn't one of them. The biggest reason is that I doubt the 3DO is going to be a huge success. $750 is way out of line for pure entertainment machine. Was the Neo Geo a success 2 years ago? We bought one, but we didn't know anyone else that did. To make matters worse, there are over 100 third-party licensees supposedly developing on 3DO. If there were only a couple of companies developing it, they might make money. I predict there's going to be some serious lossage going on in the 3DO development community." Art Data Interactive would fold as a company in late 1996 after the failure of another game called Chess Wars. The 3DO company would leave the hardware space soon after, and the 3DO was forgotten quickly by gamers who were busy enjoying their PlayStations and Nintendo 64s. In the internet age, 3DO Doom has become the stuff of internet legend. Rebecca Hyman would go on to work on other games and titles in the year after, becoming an adored figure within the Doom community as she spoke openly about the hell that was the development of 3DO Doom. During the production of this video, the news broke that Rebecca Hyman had sadly passed away after a brief battle against cancer. I felt it would be inappropriate to not address her legacy directly and pay tribute to someone who has contributed so much to the video game industry. While her work on Doom 3DO made her iconic within the Doom community, her body of work extends well beyond just Doom. With dozens of titles and conversions under her belt, Becky was also the co-founder of well-known companies like Interplay Productions, Logicware, Contraband Entertainment, and Old School. She was also a competitive gamer, traveling in 1980 to Los Angeles to compete in the regional qualifying round for the National Atari 2600 Championships. She entered that competition unranked but won the competition and then won the overall championship held later that year in New York. In 2017, she was inducted into the International Video Game Hall of Fame and in 2025 was awarded the Gaming Icon Award at the 2025 Gaming Awards. Rebecca leaves behind an incredible legacy, and one which has touched the hearts of gamers across many generations. The outpouring of love and genuine sentiment at the announcement of her death showcases the impact that she left on the industry. Many looked up to Rebecca and viewed her as a positive figure within the gaming space. She was an icon, and she was brilliant. Rest in peace, Becky, and thank you so much for the memories. Doom on 3DO was a disaster zone that not only confirmed the 3DO was dead in the water, but also signalled that the age of Doom, being considered a huge arrival on consoles, was nearing its end. The simple fact is that Doom was old hat by the release of the 3DO version, and gamers weren't super moved by its arrival like they had done previously. 3DO would not be the final Doom game released though to the 1990s consoles. Sega Saturn and PlayStation would receive more Doom content, although I'd argue in both cases that content was very questionable. Ultimately, Doom on 3DO is remembered more for the hilarity and awfulness around its development. It's an interesting and quirky part of Doom history, however I would strongly recommend that unless you're very curious to see what the absolute worst performing version of Doom is like, I would strongly just recommend not playing this one. It's really not worth your time, and if you really want to experience the Jaguar versions of Doom, PlayStation 1 Doom exists, and that's a much more solid outing.